I asked you for more questions about books and book collecting, so let's run through them. Lily Summer Originals asked for advice about getting into book collecting on a small budget, and this is a great question because I genuinely believe you can be a book collector on any budget you happen to have. This is the very first old book I bought. It's a copy of The Five Nations by Rudyard Kipling, and when we look inside we can still see the original pencil price in there of £4.95, so it didn't cost me a fortune. But I bought it because it contains one of the most haunting of all of Kipling's poems, and that's the final poem in the book, Recessional. And so while it's not a rare book or a valuable book, it still means a lot to me. So my first piece of advice is to collect in an area you can afford to collect in. Collect within your budget. Because if you want to collect Jane Austen first editions but don't have hundreds of thousands in spare cash to hand, then you're not going to get very far. But you can do extraordinary and interesting things in other areas. The biggest part of my private book collection are books about the town of St Andrews. And I chose this because most books that are of interest to me on this subject can be found in the tens or low hundreds of pounds per book. And there's only a very small handful of books that I'd want for my collection that are going to cost me, say, thousands of pounds. And I've got an example of a genuinely very rare book that I bought that didn't cost me a fortune. And it's probably the first book that I wanted to own purely because of its rarity. I first heard about it in Christopher Hitchens' memoir, Hitch 22, where he's recalling a small pamphlet of light verse printed by the poet John Fuller at the Sycamore Press. Hitchens had contributed to the volume but had lost his copy and had never been able to find another. In fact, he couldn't even recall the title of the book when he was reminiscing about it in his memoir. And that idea intrigued me, and it might have been my very earliest invocation to go and track down and find a book because it's rare. I found out the title eventually, and for years and years kept looking for it, kept an eye out for it, even had a few false leads that didn't go anywhere, until a couple of years ago I discovered online a poetry professor who was looking to thin out their collection, and he'd listed a list of books that he was willing to part with. And when I saw this title on his list, The Sycamore Miscellany, I got inordinately excited. I paid him the price that he was asking for it, which wasn't a great fortune for such a niche book of limited interest, and it arrived in the post a few days later. And you immediately see why it was rare, because here on the colophon we can see it says 50 copies of this miscellany have been printed on reconstituted waste paper, not for sale. This is number 20. And it's a really lovely relic of the Oxford that made Hitchens and poets like James Fenton, and the sort of creative hubbub that surrounded people like John Fuller and his Sycamore Press. And its chief interest is in this second section, which is a sequence of poems called Songs of the King of China, which is a collection of light, lewd, gay verse about an imaginary king of China. And I can give you an example here from the back cover. I am the king of China, I'm a patron of the prize ring, and every time my man's on top, you can feel my boxer rising. Laog 8KY asked me about my reading habits, so I thought I'd show you two books that I've been reading recently. We've got The Book at War by Andrew Pettegree and Einstein in Time and Space, A Life in 99 Particles by Samuel Graydon. The first of these is The Book at War, which is a brilliant history of the role books have played in conflict. It starts with kind of the American Revolution and goes right up to the war in Ukraine. And one thing that you notice when you study the history of conflicts is that things like, monuments men in the Second World War and works of art, what happens to them in war is often spoken about, but books have been maybe overlooked in, the general course of historical study. So this is a brilliant corrective to that. Andrew Pettegree is one of my favourite historians. I was lucky enough to attend some of his lectures at St Andrews, though he didn't teach me directly. And he's written brilliantly on the history of the book, with books like Brand Luther about the Reformation, the Library of Fragile History, which he co-wrote with Arthur de Vedeven, and The Bookshop of the World about printing and bookselling in the Dutch Golden Age, which he also co-wrote with Arthur. So highly recommend this. And the other one I'm not as far through. It's Einstein in Time and Space, A Life in 99 Particles by Samuel Graydon. I actually know Sam from one of my very first jobs in books, which was interning at the Times Literary Supplement, where he's now the science editor. He's a brilliant, brilliant writer. And the style that this book takes is to look through Einstein's life in 99 brief snapshots. And for someone who doesn't know a great deal about particle physics or Einstein himself even, it's a really brilliant, accessible way at getting, into the essence and the genius and the multifaceted part of his life. And it's a great way of looking at someone's life, not trying to, drive a narrative or correct a narrative or have an overall thesis, but just take these little snapshots throughout their life and career. And, what comes out of that is actually a really coherent story. So highly recommend both of those. Philosopher Zed asks about the green pigment found in books during the Victorian era. And this is a very popular question that I get on social media because people are worried about green books containing arsenic, which obviously we wouldn't want, but like a lot of things on the internet, the risk of finding arsenical pigments in books is overstated. It simply isn't the case that all green books of the Victorian period contain arsenic, but some do. For the most part, with these darker green cloth bindings, you're safe. Bindings containing arsenic are more commonly a lighter, fluorescent, more emerald green in colour. And to give you an idea of the prevalence of arsenical book bindings, there's the Poison Book Project at the Winterthur Library. And of the 350 books in green bindings that they initially tested, only 39 were found to contain arsenic. And if you want to learn more or read more about this subject, then my friend Ali Alvis, who's book historian on social media, has both made videos and written extensively on this very subject. Angel Hippie City Healing asks how old books were made, so I thought I'd show you with this example from the late 1700s. It was printed in 1797 and is still in completely original condition, so it's a really good example to show you. It was printed by letterpress, so every single piece of type had to be laid and arranged by hand. The pages were then printed on large sheets which were then folded twice to make gatherings of 4 leaves. Then illustrations, which would have been printed separately, are inserted between the gatherings at the appropriate points. All of these gatherings are then sewn together, and you can see examples of that sewing all up the spine here. And in little cracks in the spine, you can see those original gatherings clumped together. After being sewn, the book is then bound in boards, and these boards, as you can see, are very thin, not particularly substantial, and frankly it's a miracle that this has still survived in original condition. The covers of the boards are then covered in marbled paper, and the spine is just covered in very thin plain paper before the title label is added to complete the book. Botanic Chrysoni has asked a question about digitalisation, and this is one of the most popular subjects that I get asked about on social media, and that anyone working with historical objects of any kind frankly gets asked about on social media. And of course, digitalisation has a really important place in widening access to special collections, museums and libraries. But within the ecosystem of the rare book world, it really isn't the place for booksellers, which is what I do as a job, to work in the digitisation of these objects. Digitisation is a very expensive process that requires particular expertise, both in the formatting and arranging of the digitisation, but also in the safe handling of the object being digitised, so that in digitising it, we're not worsening the condition of it or affecting its future preservation. Because ultimately, a book sat on a shelf in a library is probably going to last longer than a digital version of it. Sheila Berrigan asked for something about the Bronte, so I thought I'd tell you about Charlotte Bronte's very first novel, which wasn't published in her lifetime. In fact, it was only published after her death. She had written it and finished it before she had written her first published novel, Jane Eyre, which came out in 1847, and she was working on it while her sisters were writing Wuthering Heights and Agnes Grey. But despite Charlotte sending the finished manuscript to every single publisher she could think of, none of them wanted to take it on. In fact, we know from her biography and letters and reminiscences of her that she used the same packing material for every publisher she sent it to, so whenever it arrived at a new one, they would see the addresses of the publishers who had already rejected the book. The novel was called The Professor, and it was eventually published in 1857, 2 years after her death, and 10 years after she set it aside to begin work on what would be her first published novel, Jane Eyre. And those dates are important because in 1846 we get the publication of the Bronte's poems, in 1847 we get Jane Eyre, Wuthering Heights and Agnes Grey, and then The Professor being published 10 years after that provides the bookend for the Bronte canon. Christina 5618 says she loved reading A Month in the Country, which I recommended in one of my videos. Do I have any other recommendations? And that's difficult because A Month in the Country is truly unlike any other book I've read, but an author that might be similar in writing style that may be worth exploring if you're interested in that central reminiscence and beautiful prose would be William Maxwell. I don't want to give too much away, but the book is called So Long, See You Tomorrow, and the central moment of reflection or reminiscence, I want to say it's Proustian, but it isn't really Proustian at all. It's far more relatable and instinctual than that. It happens when two people pass in a corridor and they both know that they know each other and remember each other, but nobody says anything. And that is the kick that takes us into the reminiscence of the story. And it's so beautifully and incredibly written. And Maxwell was a marvellous, and I still think today is a brilliantly underrated writer. Anthony White asked for a paragraph from my favourite book, and Spencer Ramsey asked for this as well. Now, normally people, when they answer this question, they go for a work of fiction, but I'm not going to read from a novel. I'm going to share with you a favourite poem and then a favourite piece of non-fiction writing. The poem is by W.H. Auden, and the piece of non-fiction writing is Clive James reminiscing on a lost Vienna. I'll end the video straight after this, so thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoy these two beautiful pieces of writing. First up, we've got Auden with Musee De Beaux Arts, and it begins, "About suffering, they were never wrong, the old masters, how well they understood its human position, how it takes place while someone else is eating, or opening a window, or just walking dully along, how, when the aged are reverently, passionately waiting for the miraculous birth, there must always be children who did not specially want it to happen, skating on a pond at the edge of the wood. They never forgot that even the dreadful martyrdom must run its course. Anyhow, in a corner, some untidy spot where the dogs go on with their doggy life and the torturer's horse scratches its innocent behind on a tree. In Bruegel's Icarus, for instance, how everything turns away quite leisurely from the disaster. The ploughman may have heard the splash, the forsaken cry, but for him it was not an important failure. The sun shone as it had to on the white legs disappearing into the green water, and the expensive, delicate ship that must have seen something amazing, a boy falling out of the sky, had somewhere to go, and sailed calmly on." And the snatch of non-fiction comes from one of my favourite books, Clive James's Cultural Amnesia. It's from his Overture to Vienna. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Vienna was the best evidence that the most accommodating and fruitful ground for the life of the mind can be something more broad than a university campus. More broad and in many ways more fun. In Vienna there was no exams to pass, learning was a voluntary passion, and wit was a form of currency. Reading about old Vienna now, you are taken back to a time that should come again, a time when education was a lifelong process. You didn't complete your education and then start your career. Your education was your career. It was never completed. If we can't remember it all, we should at least have some idea of what we have forgotten. We could, if we wished, do without remembering and gain all the advantages of travelling light. But a deep instinct, not very different from love, reminds us that the efficiency would be bought at the cost of emptiness. Finally, the reason we go on thinking is because of a feeling. We have to keep that feeling pure if we can, and if we ever lose it, try and get it back.